I have a stateful counter component as a child of the app component. Yay! But that's not really what I want. We want our child components to be dumb presentational components. In this tutorial step, we take the state and the logic out of the counter, put it in the app, and pass it in as props. We will do that by starting on the interface for the props. I'm going to say that this counter component needs to be passed in a count as a number. And since this component is no longer a stateful component, I'm going to replace it with a dumb presentational component, a functional component. I'll fix the import. I see that I've got some stray imports up there. Use optimize imports to fix it. And this interface is no longer used, and so I'll delete that. I have violated the contract in the test. You got to pass in a count, so I will pass it in. Thank you, TypeScript, for helping me on that. And I pass it in on this one as well. Save. We'll worry about these other tests later. And now my counter component is working again for those two tests by passing in a prop for the state. But we also have to model in the prop that's passed in as the logic. So I'm going to have a prop called onCounterIncrease managed by the parent component. And it's going to have a callable that takes an argument of a React mouse event with a generic of the HTML element, just like we saw before, and has void as a return value. With that in place, I can unpack it to make it a local variable, and then uncomment this and replace the handle click with my onCounterIncrease. When I save, I see that we're having trouble again. The TypeScript compiler is failing faster, saying that I am missing something. I got to pass in not just the state, but a callable. I will use just to make a fake callable and then pass that in. Do the same on this test. And with that in place, my two tests should now pass. And I see that that's true. These two tests do pass. Let's take a look at the third test. What we want is something that knows that it was clicked and that clicking was given the correct information. First, I will start by deleting these two tests. We don't really care what they started with because it's the parent component's job. In this test, I will replace it and use this handler that's passed in as the prop and check to see, use it as a spy and check to see that it was called with the information that we're passing here with the click event. And with that in place, we see that that third test does indeed pass. We could, of course, delete this test. It's the responsibility of the parent now to detect the increment by 10. We'll leave it here for now. This is actually pretty heavy. We're picking apart the event in the child component. Can we make it dumber? We can. We're going to say that it doesn't know about events. It just knows about Booleans. You pass it in whether shift was pressed or not, and then it will do the right thing. To put this to use, we're going to make a local arrow function called handleClick. And it's going to unpack the event information instead of modeling it in the interface. And it's going to get just the information that we need out of that event and call the callable on the parent. And we're going to replace the onClick with this local click handler. And this is really nice. We've decreased the surface area of the contract to just a Boolean instead of an event that could be just about anything. We'll come over to our third test and we will change it to expect to be called with just false. That test passes. We'll go ahead and delete this test since it's just a variation on what it was called with. Since we shifted logic and work to the presentation to the parent component, let's open that up and start the process of fixing it and get the test for it. On the other side, we see we have a pretty simple component here. We're going to need to model the state of the counter. So we're going to put the iCounter state back in place, and it's going to have a count that's a number. And we need to use it as a generic. And so, but we don't have any prompts that we're passing. So we'll just say object for the prompts and iCounter state for the state, the interface for the state. This also means we need a constructor. The props we will say is just an empty object. And the state on this parent component will start at 0. We've kind of seen this in a previous as well. Let's now make a method that handles the incrementing of the state. And remember, this is the thing that will be called by the child component. That's all it's going to pass is a Boolean of whether shift was pressed or not. Let's bring back the decision on how to do the incrementing, and let's set some state. But doing this as a method isn't exactly the right thing. We're going to have the same problem with it being bound, where this is bound to the event instead of the component instance. So we'll use our old friend, the arrow function, to turn this into a property and to fix the binding issue. We can now go down into the render, and when we instantiate our counter, we got to pass along a prop, and TypeScript tells us what the prop is supposed to be, and we can just say this.increment. We also, though, need to pass the original starting point, which is started on not just the starting point, but the current value, which will be updated on the parent every time the click is handled. Now we'll add some tests to check this on the app component. I'll paste in the tests and generate my imports to get it working. We'll skip over this ESLint error for now and save to see if these tests run. And take a look at what we're doing. In this case, we have an app component, and we want to get its instance and then do some work on it. We want to see what its count and then call increment on it, and then check to see if the increment goes up. Remember, we're not calling the counter. We're just calling these property method-like things on the component itself. And then we want to do the same thing with shift. Remember that logic has been moved up to the parent component now. Let's add 2 more tests that do a deep mount of the child component, which is the counter component. We're using a mount, and we're going to grab the counter component, simulate a click, and see if shift click generates 1, and without shift and with shift generates a 10, and they both work as expected, and the test pass. And remember, we've done all of this without going over to a browser, clicking every time, and not having good error messages. We stayed inside the tool, inside the IDE, got into the flow of testing, developing with confidence. Very good way of developing React and TypeScript applications.